Now, 1 second here. Now, when we talk about data ingestion, just as a brief overview of what we talked about last time, right? That's basically the process of introducing new sources into an existing system or current process that you might have. This is often characterized by data coming in from third parties. And oftentimes the quality of the data or the format of the data might not always be consistent. It also requires a sequence of operations, right? You retrieve the data, you might need to unzip or decrypt it, you parse it out, validate it, transform it, and then sort of do the ETL functions. And it's also very oftentimes recurrent, right? So it's automated in some shape or form, and it kind of runs in the background. And as you'll see here, when we talk about data ingestion, we kind of already teed up in the last webinar big challenge with data ingestion processes, right? And that is basically the second bullet here, where data sometimes can be suspect, right? You're dealing with third parties oftentimes, and those parties might not always have consistent formatting, consistent quality of their data. Their business processes could change on the fly. They could have, a loss of the normal person that runs the process. And so things change. And so our pipelines need to adapt to that to offer great and fast data ingestion. Now, when we talk about data validation, right, let's talk about the basics of it. What is data validation? So data validation is simply ensuring that the data has undergone some sort of cleansing, some sort of checks to ensure that the quality is as expected, and that it's both correct and useful. And usefulness can sort of be driven by business rules, but it can also be driven by statistical analysis, those sorts of things. Now, where do we do data validation, right? Data validation, is usually done in the pipeline where it makes sense to validate the data. So that could change depending on what type of data pipeline you're running, but it's consistently, most of the time, right, you would want to do that at the beginning and at the end, or oftentimes somewhere in between, just depends on the data pipeline. What level, right? So when we talk about where, we also need to talk about the level that the data validation is happening. And that could be at the record level, at the file level, it could be at the process level as well, right? So different types of data checks for different qualities that you're checking against. So how do we accomplish and scale data validation, right? So accomplishing data validation is easy. So oftentimes when you have a very simple pipeline with one sort of source system, but it can also get very complicated and very cumbersome when you have multiple data sources. And as your data scales up, unfortunately, oftentimes your validation needs to scale with it, right? So as you get more data, oftentimes you get more bad data, right? It's usually a percentage of the data files that you get or a percentage of the data records that you get. And so data validation needs to be able to scale along with your data pipelines. So that way, oftentimes you might need to have a different data pipeline for each different source, but that's not ideal. So you want to sort of do it in a single data pipeline, even when the sources and formats can vary. Now, the last thing we'll kind of cover in this webinar is sort of what actions to take after the data is validated, right? Do you keep processing or do you fail the record? And if you fail, do you fail the record or the entire ingestion process? Do you keep processing and log invalid or suspect data? And how do you present the validation results to provide actionable insight for your end users? So some common objectives for data validation, right? Obviously, we want to reduce the burden on our clients and customers. So we want to fix common errors without intervention. So maybe designing your data pipelines to account for some variations in data that you see sort of consistently at an irregular basis, if you will. You also want to inform them early so that they can fix issues before they accumulate. As they do incremental data loads, if more and more bad data gets processed, that could lead to a bigger challenge of cleanup and recovery of the good records. You also want to provide robust reporting on the pipeline. So that could very well mean that even if you pass data quality checks, that you still provide reporting just to ensure that confidence in your data quality. But also you can use it to sort of view trends in your data quality. Maybe you notice that certain records or certain errors pop up more often on certain days of the week, on certain criteria, that sort of thing. So you can validate that across time, across different source systems, that sort of thing. Also, you want to sort of empower your less technical staff to view validation results, right? So that way they can take actions to correct and reprocess data as needed. You also want to design for resilience. So that way your data pipeline can handle inconsistent formats and validation can sort of continue despite those inconsistent formats. And then, of course, orchestrating from end to end and reusability is going to be a key, right? So new client does not equal new data pipeline. The data checks and business rules can change, but we sort of still leverage the same data pipeline regardless. How we're going to sort of accomplish that is we're going to take a look at two major tools that Clover DX offers regarding data quality, and that is profiling and validation. So the first one, profiling, is going to be a statistical analysis of the quality of data, right? So this is going to give you a sort of overarching view of the data that's being loaded. This could be the entire file, it could be an entire subset of files, but it's going to give you that holistic view and assessment and allows you to do statistical analysis on that data. It also allows you to take a look at the data as a whole, so that way you can prevent processing before you actually insert the records. You can kind of fail the records if needed. And it also allows you to kind of detect data decay and trends in your data. The second tool we're going to take a look at is validation. Now, validation is a business-specific analysis of the data quality. And so you can imagine that this is at the record level using business rules, and it'll allow you to identify bad records and kind of get actionable error messages. It'll allow you to sort of process or continue processing the good records if you want to sort of go down that route, and then reroute the bad data. Now, before we jump into the actual example that we're going to take a look at, I just wanted to kind of tee up a brief overview of Clover DX. Clover DX offers a data management platform, and that platform can handle a variety of situations. It can handle, various bespoke systems. So, it can handle multiple data sources of multiple different types, everything from flat files to FTP and SFTP, those sorts of things, to more complicated things like XML and JSON via, API requests. It can also handle complex scenarios. So lots of different ways to transform your data and also validate your data, which we'll be focusing on. It allows you to deal with messy data. So, you can kind of clean that up. And it allows you to sort of scale out your solution so you can meet tight time deadlines. So that way you can deliver your products on time and provide that consistent sort of SLAs for your clients and end users. At a high level, right, Clover DX comes in two main pieces, designer and server. And you can kind of see that over here. Designer is where, as you'd expect, you're designing and sort of coding out your data pipelines, testing them out. And then once you're ready, you can sort of deploy them to server. Server is where it would allow you to sort of scale your solution, add additional CPU cores, do clustering, all that kind of good stuff, and then automate it and give you notifications for when things might go awry. And then finally, for Clover DX, we also, we provide that data management platform, but we also provide a team of consultants that are focused on both solution delivery and customer enablement, right? So if you want, you can definitely get Clover DX and be up and running within a short amount of time with just training. Or we can kind of handhold and provide you assistance and guidance while you're, kind of creating your data pipelines. all the way to allowing us to take over the creation of those data pipelines based upon your requirements. We can kind of handle and deliver a full solution end to end. Now, for this example, we're going to take a look at ingesting operational data for reporting. And in this example, I'll kind of go over what the data pipeline is doing overall and how data validation plays a major role in that. So in this, basically, we're allowing customers to upload operational data, and in return, we're providing sort of on-demand, summarized, analyzed view of that data. So you can imagine that the overall process looks something like this, right? We sort of have Clover DX sort of in the middle here that's doing all of the data crunching, but we also have multiple sources and end users, right? So each sort of source system has its own target end users, and they all upload data, and then we provide reporting back out to those end users. So this data pipeline, although it is a single data pipeline, it serves a multitude of different vendors, different customers. And so that way it can kind of handle that inconsistent format. Now, overall, the ingestion pipeline is pretty standard. We're monitoring two different sources, right? Either FTP for files or an email source, email inbox, right, for incoming files. That way, if for some reason they need to process data out of band or have an issue and need to re-upload data, they can simply email it over to us, and we can kind of pick up the data from there. The ingestion process at a high level, right, involves basically copying some files from the FTP server, unzipping them, checking the manifest to make sure that all the files that we expect for that particular client are indeed present. Then we do some profiling, which is what we'll focus on, and then we transform load to data and then log our results. So if you sort of turn those steps that I mentioned sideways, you can kind of see the data pipeline as it emerges. And the part that we're going to focus on is confirming those expected files and performing data quality checks, right? That's where we're doing a bulk of our validation before we actually execute the transformations and provide the actual output to that target system. Now, this is a screenshot of Clover DX Designer. This is the actual data pipeline that we will be taking a look at. And as you can see, we're kind of pulling in data, reformatting a bit, and then processing those, and then logging the data, right? So if we take a closer look, you can kind of see those steps here, just blown up a little bit for you, so it's a little bit easier to see. The part that we're going to focus on is actually this process site. Although it looks just like one little component within the data pipeline, it in fact opens up to a whole ingestion pipeline. That ingestion pipeline sort of looks like this, right? And so in this data pipeline, you can see that we're checking the FTP files. We're sort of listing the files, checking to see if we need to unzip them. If we do, we kind of unzip them. Then we're checking against a manifest down here so that we compare the sort of incoming files with the list of expected files. Finally, we're sort of doing a profile of the data, and that's where a bulk of the data validation takes place. But as I highlighted here, right, you can kind of see all the different locations where we're doing some sort of data check or quality assessment, right? The first one being whether or not it's zipped, right? Because we want to handle the files whether or not they're zipped. And if they're zipped, we sort of unzip them and sort of handle that without even logging it as an error. So that's nice in that, it kind of adjusts the data on the fly and sort of doesn't even require any manual intervention. Next, in step 3, we're kind of cross-checking, right, the data as it comes in with what we're expecting. And then we're doing a little bit of filtering to make sure that we're only checking data files that we want. And then finally, we're doing a profiling step, which is where the bulk of the additional validation takes place. So if we zoom into that profiling step, it sort of looks like this, right? We're taking a flat file, we're running two data pipelines against it, essentially. We're doing a profiler, which I mentioned in the previous slides, that kind of gives us that holistic overarching view of the data. And if that sort of passes our validation, we're actually writing out that data to a database writer, or we're failing it. We're also, though, performing some business rules, right? These business rules don't necessarily stop the data from processing, but they do record sort of suspect data or any bad data that we might get. We're logging that eventually to an Excel file, and that Excel file, in this case, is there's two Excel files generated, one by school. We're taking a look at school data in this example, and one by the date that the error occurred. And with that, I will actually jump into our example here with Clover DX. So 1 second here while I pull up my designer view. So here we sort of have that data ingestion pipeline as I highlighted. And it sort of, checks the FTP site, does a little bit of reformatting, deduplication, and then processes the files. And then once it processes, it kind of logs those records to the sort of valid endpoints, right? And so you have the ability there to sort of change your data pipeline or process your data pipeline depending on the type of record that's coming in. So if we open up this particular part of the data pipeline, you can sort of see the data as it's coming in and how it's being processed, right? So these are all of the various steps that we're taking. First checking to see if it's zipped or not, then cross-checking with our manifest, and then finally doing a profiling, and then eventually transforming the data and logging that to, in this case, an S3 bucket. So most of the data validation is going to actually occur in this profile step. So that actually involves a series of steps as well, right? So if I open up the data pipeline here, you can sort of see those various steps. What I'm going to do actually is run this data pipeline and allow us to actually take a deeper look at the data pipeline and how it's processing all those records. So the first thing we're going to do is just check the FTP, pick up the files that we need, filter them out, and then do the actual data ingestion process. You can see here as records flow across, you can see the numbers of files that are coming across and how they're kind of changing over time, right? We eventually end up with just 3 records based upon whether or not those ingestion pipelines are enabled or not. Then we're doing processing on each of these sort of source systems, right? So if I open up under this execution label here, you can sort of see the 3 different schools in this case that we're processing data for and what the status of each of those are, right? So you can see here, for example, we have Pine Tree Middle School. If I open that up, you can see the records as they kind of come across. And if I open up the actual profiling step, you can see that we're profiling based upon a series of criteria. So in here, we have files that come in for Pine Tree Middle School that involve data records based upon classes, enrollment, students, teachers, that sort of thing. So you have the ability to take a look at any one of those and see what the validation results are, right? So if I open up, for example, classes here, you could see here that we sort of, let me zoom in a little bit. You can see here that we sort of processed the records and that, everything was validated as expected, right? No sort of errors within the data files. And so therefore we didn't log any sort of issues. Now, if we take a look at some another school record, you might be able to see some sort of validation issues or errors within those records, right? So in here we have Springfield Middle School. In this case, we're still at a high level, taking a look at the data and profiling it. In this case, our validator at a high level is just taking a look for how many null records there are. If we expect that the null records are going to be very high, then that'll give us sort of an error, right? So in this case, we're looking for null records, and as long as it's less than 10%, we're going to kind of continue processing. If it's greater than 10%, we would stop processing and sort of throw out an error and alert the end user that there was an issue with the files uploaded. So in this case, we kind of continued processing and we wrote out the data to a database. This database eventually sort of informs another data pipeline where we pull out the record, right? So in this case, we have a database reader in another separate pipeline. Of course, this pipeline could be completely integrated into the existing one, but we kind of separate it out here to run it on an ad hoc basis as needed. So we have basically just reading from that same exact table where we wrote the profiling results, and we're kind of creating a spreadsheet from that information, right? And so if I pull up that spreadsheet here for you guys, you can see sort of what's being pulled out of that logging information, right? So in this case, we're looking at the number of null records versus the number of total records. And you can see sort of, even though we haven't reached that critical threshold of 10%, that the data is trending in the wrong direction for, in this case, teacher records, right? So we're getting more and more null counts for teacher records. And even before we hit that 10% threshold, if you put this information in front of the end user or in front of your sort of support team, then you can sort of address the error before it even reaches that threshold, right? So you might want to reach out to the school, let them know that that there's some sort of issue with the teacher records and that we're seeing more and more null records for teacher IDs in this case. And so this is great in that it allows you to sort of fix your data before it even fails, right? And so that's what ideally you want to do in most of these scenarios, right? Now, if we go back to our ingestion pipeline, one second here. If you go back to our ingestion pipeline, you can also see that we have a subset of business rules that we're validating against. And what's nice about this is that you can imagine that each of these schools have different business rules, right? They might have different ways that they format the teacher ID. They might have different ways that they format the school class ID, for example. All of these things are very specific to each individual system, each individual school or data source, right? So you can imagine that the validator just takes a look at null records. That's pretty basic across the board, but these business rules have to change based upon what source we're looking at. And so how do we handle this, right? How do we scale up our data ingestion pipeline as we scale up the number of sources that we're pulling in from, right? And that is basically, instead of having validation rules here listed explicitly, what we're doing is we're externalizing the business rules here. So we're taking a look at a file that sits within our data platform, and we have a file sort of for each individual school, right? So depending on what school it is, this variable essentially changes, right? And it allows you to sort of change the validation rules on per individual source system. So that's great in that you can sort of scale up and have more and more complex business rules for each individual system, each individual even record type, right? Because you can imagine, even if you're talking about one school, in this case, Springfield Middle School, the validation and business rules for classes versus students and teachers, right, is going to be completely different. And so you can sort of see that exact validation file. It kind of sits out here. In this case, we're taking a look at classes. And so, you can see here that we have a variable that is called validation file, and that kind of has information about each individual source system and each of their file types. So that allows you to sort of scale out your solution and then sort of report on that. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight here is that, you might have errors that are soft errors and that don't necessarily lead to stopping your ingestion pipeline, but that you should still inform your end users about, right? And so we talked about a little bit about how you should inform them in a way that's meaningful, in a way that allows them to kind of quickly take action where needed, right? And so in here, we have sort of two Excel reports. One that is a school report and one that is a date report, right? And so these Excel reports sort of give you the same information, they just present it in two different ways, right? And so what you might want to do with that is you might want to have, bad records by schools, for example, given to an end user, the various school systems, right? So you can imagine that you group it together by school system and you provide that to the actual person in charge of that school and the data that's coming from that school. Whereas bad records by date, you might want to have as something internal, right? You want to check to see how your data pipelines are running over time and how records look over time. And so you can present both of those forms of Excel data to various end users, depending on who would get the most use out of each one.